While this course is on human anatomy and for a large part of it, the gross human anatomy, that is the part of or the parts of the human body that we can see with the naked eye without a microscope. We are certainly going to discuss also microscopic anatomy. And because of that, and certainly because of the macroscopic anatomy as well, we need to discuss the smallest living units within the body, and those are the cells. Without the cells, our body would be nothing because our body is composed of an enormous amount of cells in addition to water. So one could really break down the human body into water and into cells. So let's delve into a fairly brief discussion on cell biology. So the first thing we need to grasp our heads around is the fact that there are about 75 trillion cells in the human body. And that's an enormous number of cells. It's actually a number that is really hard for us to really understand. But our body is made up of approximately 75 trillion cells. It could be upwards of 100 trillion, as low as 50 trillion. Nonetheless, that is a very, very, very large number of cells in the body. And once again, the cells are the smallest living unit of the body. And to be clear, we will talk about tissues in the body as well. Cells make up tissues, whereas elements or atoms make up molecules, molecules make up cells, cells make up tissues in our body. There are only 4 broad categories of tissues in the body: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. But all those tissues are composed of cells. So let's take a closer look at all of these cells. So while we suggested there's roughly 75 trillion cells in the body, there is roughly 200 distinct types of cells. So we have red blood cells, which are the cells within our blood that are responsible for transporting oxygen to the tissues, and certainly to a lesser degree, carbon dioxide away from the tissues. We have neurons, which are nerve cells, which are the excitable cells of our nervous system. We have enterocytes, which are specialized cells of our digestive system. Myocytes, anytime you see the prefix myo, that's referring to muscle. Anytime you see the suffix cyte, that's referring to cell. So a myocyte is a muscle cell. We have 3 types of muscle cells in the body. We have myocardial cells. Those are the heart muscle cells. We have smooth muscle cells, which are the type of muscle that are lining tubes within the body, lining the digestive tract, lining blood vessels, what have you. And then we also have skeletal muscle cells or skeletal myocytes. And those are the muscles that attach to the bones in our body and allow our skeleton to move. Hepatocytes are cells specific to the liver, and they have a wide breadth of functions within the liver. Keratinocytes are specialized cells of our epidermis on the topmost layer of our skin. Glial cells are support cells for our nervous system, along with the neurons. And that's not to say the neurons are the support cells. The glial cells are the support cells, and they really support the neurons. And there's a lot more glial cells than neurons, even though that neurons are talked about as being the nerve cell. But more on that when we get to the nervous system. We have sperm cells, which are the male gametes, macrophages and T cells, which are just a couple of the cells of the immune system. Macrophages engage in a process known as phagocytosis, which engulfs foreign debris or dead or decrepit cells of our own body. T cells also help engage and carry out our adaptive immune system. And then ova are the female gametes. So these are just a few examples of the 200 specific types of cells in the body. So the goal here is we're going to talk about the general morphology of cells, what's in cells, what their specific role for the cells are, the plasma membrane, which are the boundary of cells or the walls of the cells that confine everything within a cell. The plasma membrane is composed of a phospholipid bilayer. We're not going to go into that in too much detail because there's a lot of biochemistry that needs to be understood to talk about that in detail. But the phospholipid bilayer makes up the plasma membrane of cells. The cytoplasm is the interior of the cell. I'm also going to talk about cytosol, which is not to be confused with cytoplasm. Cytosol is the fluid component within the cell, within the cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is merely the space. So if you're sitting in a room, a closed room, that entire space within that room would be the cytoplasm. If you filled that room from the floor all the way up to the ceiling with a jelly-like substance, that would be the cytosol. And then the nucleus is a specific organelle within the cell that houses the genetic material. So organelles are little machinery within cells that have specific functions. So we're going to talk about all of those, and certainly the nucleus is really one of the more important organelles within the body. And that's maybe a silly statement because all the organelles have very specialized roles, and without them, the cells and the body can't do what they need to do. But before we talk specifically about the cells, we need to talk about fluids, because I suggested earlier that the body is really composed of cells and fluids. And the human body is composed of upwards of 60 to 70% of water. And we can break down that water, the fluid components, into two specific regions, within the cell and outside of the cell. So in tan here, we have a cell. Don't worry about the green, the blue, and the purple on the periphery of the cell embedded within the plasma membranes, within the plasma membrane, but that is merely a channel and some receptors. But that is a cell. It's one of the 75 trillion cells in the body. The red structure on the bottom is a blood vessel. Any fluid confined within the cells of our body is known as intracellular fluid. Intra means within. Intracellular fluid, any fluid outside of cells, and in this image right here, it would be anything in white, including the blood vessel. Anything outside of cells is the extracellular fluid. The intracellular fluid of all the cells of our body, all the 75 trillion cells, make up 2/3 of the fluid volume within our body. That is to say, the great majority of fluid in our body is confined within cells, within the plasma membrane, occupying the cytoplasm. Now, to be clear, I talked about cytosol. Cytosol and intracellular fluid are synonymous with each other. They are the same thing. Outside of cells, the fluid outside of cells is the extracellular fluid. Any fluid in the body that is not confined within cells is under the umbrella of extracellular fluid. So the fluid within blood vessels, known as blood plasma, is part of the extracellular fluid. We have other types of vessels in the body known as lymphatic vessels that carry a fluid known as lymph. That is also part of the extracellular fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid is part of the extracellular fluid. The fluids in our eyes, the aqueous and vitreous humor, is part of the extracellular fluid. Fluid in our joints, such as synovial fluid, is part of extracellular fluid. We have fluid that surrounds some major organs, or many of the major organs in our body. Specific, for example, pericardial fluid, which is a type of serous fluid that helps protect and lubricate the movement of the heart. Serous fluids, pericardial fluid, is part of the extracellular fluid. Another serous fluid known as pleural fluid that surrounds the lungs is extracellular fluid. So any fluid that is not part of or is not confined within cells is extracellular fluid. Extracellular fluid makes up 1/3 of the fluid of our body. Intracellular fluid makes up 2/3. Now I'm going to throw out one more term here, and that is interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid in this image right here would be fluid occupying any of the white space. It does not include the blood plasma. The great majority of the extracellular fluid is confined within the blood plasma, But interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that bathes the cells, or the fluid that the cells are suspended in, if you will, is known as interstitial fluid. Okay, let's take a look at another cell right here. And in this image, in addition to talking about the fluids, I want to talk about some surface modifications of the plasma membrane. So in orange is the plasma membrane. It confines all the organelles within the cell. It confines the intracellular fluid within the cell. It separates everything from within the cell from everything that's outside of the cell. So a couple of surface modifications we're going to look at are right here. We have what are known as microvilli. Microvilli increase the surface area of the cell. As we take a close-up look at this, we can see these are merely undulations of the plasma membrane. And actually, if you were to stretch that out, hopefully you would be able to understand how that's increasing the outer surface of the plasma membrane, or the surface of the plasma membrane, increasing the surface area. And we will have all sorts of receptors, channels, proteins embedded within these microvilli to allow for more activity, more things moving into the cell, and more things moving out of the cell. For example, what we see right here on the bottom right is a channel. And I'm not specifying what type of channel it is, but it's allowing certain entities or things to move out of the cell or into the cell. And this is a very simplified version of a channel. Channels tend to be very specific. For example, there might be a sodium ion channel that allows nothing but sodium to pass through it, and specifically allows sodium to pass from the extracellular fluid into the cell, into the cytoplasm. But those details aren't important at this moment. I'm just trying to demonstrate cells have channels that allow things to come in and out of cells. Cells also have receptors like we see on the bottom left over here. And hormones will bind to these receptors, neurotransmitters will bind to these receptors, other types of signaling molecules like paracrines and autocrines will bind to these receptors. And the binding of signaling molecules to these receptors are going to elicit some sort of cellular response. A lot of these receptors and channels are going to be embedded within the microvilli of the cell because that's where the increased surface area is. I'm not suggesting they're not going to be on parts of the plasma membrane that don't have microvilli, but the more microvilli, or I should say, the greater the surface area of a cell, the more opportunity to have activity for that cell, things moving in it, things binding to it, any sort of metabolic activity. And one more thing I want to say about the microvilli increasing surface area. The microvilli are important because cells can only be so large. If we have 75 trillion cells in the body, we are certainly limited by space. So one could, or the body could, increase the surface area by just making these cells larger. But by making the cells larger, we're minimizing the space and we have less of an opportunity to have those 75 trillion cells in the body. So the microvilli are increasing surface area when we have a limited amount of space. Another surface modification that looks very, very similar to microvilli, at least under a microscope, and it can be a very challenging effort to distinguish between microvilli and cilia if you don't have the expertise. But these are the cilia right here. In cilia, and I've drawn them significantly different in this image just to elaborate or to show that the features on the right are cilia and the features on the left are microvilli. But the cilia are surface modifications aimed at moving fluids that are surrounding a cell, that are in contact with a cell. And it's not necessarily even moving fluids, it's moving things within fluids. So for example, cilia will propel or distribute mucus. Mucus traps debris in the trachea, among other places. And the cilia propel that mucus superiorly out of the trachea so microorganisms, bacteria, pathogens don't enter our lower respiratory tract. Those details aren't important at this point. But cilia are aimed at moving things away from cells, whereas microvilli are there to increase surface area of the cell. Over here on the upper right, we have a flagellum, which is singular for flagella. These are surface modifications that are similar to cilia, though there tends to just be one. And the wisping motion of these flagella propel these cells. So the difference between cilia and flagella, the cilia propel things away from the cell, whereas a flagellum in this case is propelling that individual cell from point A to point B, and we find those with sperm cells. Let's take a look at the cell. This is a very basic depiction of a cell. The outermost part here is the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane is a phospholipid bilayer, and the term bi is suggesting two layers. And we can see an inner layer right here and an outer layer right here, separated by the yellow right here. That is the plasma membrane. Everything within the plasma membrane, once again, is the cytoplasm, which is occupied by organelles. So in this particular cell, I don't have all the organelles represented in this cell, but we have mitochondria, we have smooth endoplasmic reticulum, rough endoplasmic reticulum, the nucleus with the nucleolus right in the center. These structures right here are DNA molecules. They contain the genetic information of the cell, and this is the Golgi apparatus. So let's start with the mitochondria that we see in green. Mitochondria do contain genetic material. The great overwhelming majority of genetic material of our cells, of our body, are confined to the nucleus that we see right here. Now, some cells have one nuclei. Some cells are multinucleated. They have more than one nucleus. And that's where we find the great majority of the genetic material. There is some genetic material housed within the mitochondria of cells, but the main purpose of mitochondria is to produce ATP. ATP is a molecule that allows our body to do work, and our body is constantly having to do work on the grand scale if we're lifting things up, if we're running, but it's also doing work at the molecular and biochemical level. And ATP is needed for any type of work in the body. Now, to be clear, ATP can be made outside of the mitochondria in the cytoplasm, but it's much more efficient to make ATP within the mitochondria. Cells that require a lot of ATP tend to have more mitochondria. The cellular process that produces ATP is known as cellular respiration. And to be clear, the production of ATP outside of the mitochondria does not require oxygen, but the production of ATP within the mitochondria does require oxygen, hence the name cellular respiration. Mitochondria produce ATP. Now let's go to the genetic material within the nucleus. The genetic material is a blueprint for making structures and things within the body. And those things are almost always proteins. Proteins make up a wide breadth of things in the body, and I'm going to list those in a subsequent slide here. But a lot of these other structures within the body are along the pathway of making proteins. That is to say, some of these other organelles have roles within making proteins, but the code or instructions to make those proteins is derived from the genetic material, the DNA found in the nucleus. So proteins are produced by ribosomes, which we see peppered right here, and they are on top of the endoplasmic reticulum. Endoplasmic reticulum with ribosomes attached to the outer membrane is known as the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Here we don't see ribosomes attached to this endoplasmic reticulum, hence the name smooth endoplasmic reticulum. But the rough endoplasmic reticulum, along with the Golgi apparatus, produce and package proteins. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum that we see right here synthesizes steroid hormones and also stores calcium. And it depends on what type of cell we're talking about. If we're talking a muscle cell, the sole role of the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, or I should say the main role of the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, is to store calcium. Calcium is an ion that is found in large quantities in the extracellular fluid, but also within the cell confined to the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. So the Golgi apparatus, which packages the proteins, the ribosomes, and the rough endoplasmic reticulum, which help produce or synthesize the proteins from the instructions from the DNA. The nucleolus produces the subunits of the ribosomes, these structures peppered onto the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And going back to the proteins, what do proteins make up in the body? They make up channels. And when I say channels, these channels that are bound within plasma membranes, allowing things into and out of cells. Receptors we talked about are on the periphery of cells, allowing things like hormones and neurotransmitters and other signaling molecules to bind to cells. Hormones are a specific type of signaling molecule that travels through the blood to elicit cellular activity somewhere downstream. Insulin is a prime example of a proteinaceous hormone. Not all hormones are made of proteins, to be clear, but insulin is one protein that is composed or is built by proteins. Insulin is a hormone that regulates blood sugar levels in the body. Enzymes are made of proteins. Fibers within the body. Collagen is the most ubiquitous protein within the body, and it helps with structural integrity of the body. Muscles are composed of protein. Antibodies, part of our immune system, are composed of proteins. And hemoglobin, which is a protein within our red blood cells that oxygen binds to, and to a lesser degree, carbon dioxide binds to, for transport throughout the body. So that's a brief interlude into cell biology, which is the basis for all the tissues and functioning that we'll talk about later.